Hello, this is Robert from DSP Plug. How many inventors came up with a really fantastic idea? And how many times did theorists like Isaac Newton never actually get to realize their dreams? A Newton sprite had almost been practically realized. And the issue with Newton sprites is that though they are a very similar idea to the electromagnetic dust controllers and drones, utilizing polarization, as I explained, is that the math is quite old. I've heard stories, by speaking of older people, in regards to the almost practical application of such technologies, and likely if there was any derivatives, their utilization would have been purely industrial. But moreover, due to their sensitive nature, likely these technologies were purely in a theoretical or even alpha form. And given that, and given the predated math, the types of logarithms, the types of measurement systems would undoubtedly be linear. And with that said, the ability to utilize this math for physics and for the idea of making something that's almost like a nuclear bomb, if you will, is that the math itself does rely on physics in nature. And that would mean that there would be a center point, and the center point would be in the middle of the earth, of course, because we're the center of everything. At least that is what earlier scientists had decided. But with that in mind, and with these earlier eccentric logarithm-like mathematics, which I have no doubt could be very precise, is that the measurement systems uh, were almost entirely incompatible with X and Y coordinates. And why I say X and Y is there's no reason to say Z merely because you can choose X and Y, and perhaps you can have a 45-degree angle along X and Y, which is called a bob. And with that bob, of course, being that it is 45-degree angle, it is naturally a range finder. So you might see these on old sniper scopes, you might see these on old tank scopes, and I think they still use such things for things like intercontinental ballistic missile arming and targeting technology. Really interesting, really fascinating, but there had never been a means theoretically, and that's what imperial kids used to do. They used to enjoy contemplating and writing things down and working with numbers. There must have been a time where they wondered if they might actually work. I'm sure it would have been very intriguing for them to attempt the technology, but we still would have hit a snag, wouldn't we? And that is the wobble of the earth. I had contemplated that and realized that in my initial videos, and getting dynamic points so as to figure out the wobble of the earth upon the earth's rotational axis would allow even newtons to be considered, but of course the strange measurement system needs to be reverse engineered so as to convert everything to proper XY coordinates. And being that the mathematical grid design for the Earth itself might have to become extroverted, and then the center of the grid, if you will, or many grids, change then to the ability to consider that on a spatial plane, so as to consider our orbit, so as to consider the way that the planet moves around, a certain rotational spin and around the sun and what have you. That would get even more complicated, wouldn't it? I do love XY coordinates, and it's just like the bob, and it's just like the extra Z. The extra Z does allow more practically applied mathematical theorists and physicists, um, to be able to actually put it into application. And I find the dust controller, the dust drones and the sprites, if you will, you could call them sprites, I guess. Even though sprites was from the far out theory by Lawson, which is an interesting idea. You could say that without a doubt, XY coordinates could be dynamically mapped. It doesn't matter whether the Earth is rotating. There could be a way of statically creating a grid that would work in space as well. But unfortunately, with the variance provided as you would go around this rim that I suggested might work, there would possibly be auto-correcting mechanisms, because as you moved and as the space tracks changed with the types of satellites that had kind of a pivot hub, if you will, the math would always have to be correct, and at least it is not a logarithm. At least the X and Y coordinates would make it a simpler matter, so as to autocorrect it until we came up with a more finite measurement system for the space and planets. One might look way back and consider Thoth's ideas. Thoth was somebody from afar who Egypt had considered as quite a genius person, and it could be that his methods of a very eccentric methods of divining coordinates and astronomy could come into play. Definitely could come into play for the ability to create controllers, dust controllers. I just call it dust. Why would you call it anything else? It's just a little speck of something. And because that thing is polarized, it becomes like a processor. Because that thing would be imperfect, there would be a natural tesseract possible, especially if the polarizer, which would be a controller that makes another controller, we're able to then create a variance, a three-dimensional variance, which could create an internal dynamic tesseract so as to have it have a natural processor. The natural processor would not need anything but the ability, perhaps through infrared beam in its infancy, so to contact another satellite in tandem, or another pivot, if you will, to relay data back to the Earth. Really interesting stuff. There really isn't an end of things that you could do with this technology. But the problem is the math. Imperial math, as good as it was, the royals had never really given us plain people a chance to even look at this stuff And they did whatever they could so as to limit the amount of math that we had access to. And of course, academia had changed. And the realization of academia and our academic students' abilities was overshadowed by imperial people, those of royal lineage. And I've always considered that and wondered when there would be a time. When would be a time that these types of mathematics could be utilized so that people could have a lot of fun? But there is still the risk, of course, and that falls upon every military in the world. And that is why I suggest at the North and South poles, if there is the ability to only scan with pivots one country for that country. So that country has access to the statistics and the data, and every other country that falls in line with the pivots would only have access to their stuff. And if they still wanted to use satellites, let it be for their stuff, nobody else's. And as soon as the satellite orbits around the Earth and it comes away from their own land, well, maybe another country can use it while it's at that point above their own continent or island or land mass. Now, the really interesting thing about using these dust controllers is thin steel. Thin steel. We've always thought about steel as being thick and strong and rigid, and we seem to be in love with it, but why can't steel be even thinner? Let me tell you, I know for a fact about how springs are made. They've been used for just about everything. And the method of creating them has been heat, it's been air pressure, it's been the combination of both, it's been acid of various types, and some acid types which even led to the creation of hydrogen bombs. Some of them, for instance, also led to the innovations of nuclear science and the various nuclear innovations of our time and of the latter. But if you really consider it, all you need to do is flex the steel, very thin steel, if you will, in such a algorithmic harmonic so as to consistently make it strong. And when I've spoken about the Stargate and the walkway, if you will, that leads all the way to other planets and to the moon and what have you, and orbits and changes and fluctuates as it does with these hinges and joints. Then you also have to consider that the harmonic which resonates would always be healing this steel made out of junk. You see? So the steel would always be healing, changing, fluctuating, and various controllers at various times would be constantly fixing it. The steel would be so hard that even a planet bumping up against it would not crush it just because of the natural harmonic would act like a shield. So simple. And furthermore, the sprites or the dust controllers, if you will, would be able to create something like a radiation so as to create naturally healing steel. Naturally healing steel is very important. For something like this, we need the technology to be completely viable. And if it's made out of junk, fantastic. So what are we looking at? Maybe a 20-year window. But in the meantime, our industry can start using this. But like I said, it should be controlled by our governments. It should be controlled by the military. We don't simply want people utilizing this technology for everything, do we? But to have access to thinner, harder steel means that we can serve our resources, that we're mature, responsible adults who realize that there will be no end of steel if we're to use it the right way. And what we're seeing in today's age is a large amount of raw steel being thrust out from any country that might make cars, and they just sit around rusting and rotting. That is unacceptable to me. I see a chance for us all to have as much steel as we'd like, to refine it to be just as hard as we like. And frankly, the window of opportunity that we have to utilize these resources is ever dwindling the more that rust is created. This is Robert from DSP Plug talking about this beautiful, dangerous idea that not only allows us to go to different places and to enjoy the breeze, but also how it might be used so to responsibly prepare us for something better, or something that doesn't constantly harp on our minds and tell us that we're these consumers that keep using things like paper towel, that do walk away from recycled products, but recycled products do exist, and I use them. I do use paper towel, admittedly. It's very hard to find good cloths, but I've been using good t-shirts. Here is the product here. I bought it at Home Hardware. It's called Wipes. Now, Wipes is all recycled t-shirts. Why not recycle? Recycling is good. Being a responsible consumer means that you can even save money. $16.99. Maybe it could be a bit cheaper, but it's really great for cleaning up stuff, and I recommend you try it. And imagine what Sprites could do for laundry. Ooh, man, the cleanest shirt I've ever worn. Free of sweat, free of grease, because, man, I'm not so much of a greasy man, but I've worked in some hot, humid places, and let me tell you, they don't have air conditioning. And that is a trial and a challenge in itself. Bye-bye.